Hi, Team Roth&Co. My name is Dr. Michael Greenberg, and I am a clinical psychologist specializing in anxiety and OCD. I'm happy to be here today to share some thoughts with you about how to navigate feeling anxious or scared during the pandemic. So the topics that we're going to cover today are navigating fear and anxiety, the importance of setting boundaries, and the importance of self-care. When it comes to navigating your anxiety during this time, the most important idea to keep in mind is that there is a difference between feeling afraid and ruminating. Feeling afraid is a feeling, whereas ruminating is thinking. It's a thought process. Fear is a healthy and appropriate response to threat. Feeling afraid right now is not pathological and it's not unhealthy. In fact, it's an appropriate response to what's going on. Instead of trying to convince yourself to not feel afraid or falsely reassuring yourself that everything will be okay, try giving yourself permission to feel afraid. It's fine to do things, it's even good to do things that soothe yourself, to take care of yourself when you're feeling afraid, like listening to music or calling a friend or anything else that calms you down. So I'm not saying that you should make yourself feel afraid on purpose. What I'm saying is that you shouldn't argue with yourself. When you're feeling afraid, don't try to convince yourself that somehow you shouldn't be feeling that. Try acknowledging that you're feeling afraid and giving yourself permission to feel that way. The same goes for dealing with other people's emotions. If somebody is feeling afraid or somebody tells you that they're scared, don't tell them not to feel that way. Here are some examples of things that you should not say to someone who is afraid. Don't say, there's no reason to be afraid. Don't say, you can't feel that way, you can't let yourself feel that way. Don't tell them everything is going to be okay, you shouldn't be scared. Those are examples of responses that are invalidating. You're telling someone that they shouldn't feel the way they feel, when in reality, they're perfectly entitled to feel the way they feel, and the way that they feel actually makes a lot of sense. Here are some examples of ways that you can respond to somebody who's expressing fear without being invalidating. For example, you could say, you're scared. That makes sense, but I'm here with you. You could say, I'm also afraid, but we're going to get through this together. You could say, it makes sense that you're scared, but we're just going to take this one day at a time. But feeling afraid is not the same thing as ruminating. Rumination is not a feeling, it's a thought process. Basically, rumination is trying to come up with all of the things that could go wrong so that you can figure out how to protect yourself from it. While this might sound like a good idea, it's not, because as you're doing this, you're keeping your mind full of all of the worst possibilities of what could potentially happen and making yourself very anxious. If you want to sit down and systematically think about how you would handle a certain situation that might arise, like for example, what's our plan in case XYZ person in our family gets sick, how would we handle that? That's okay, as long as you're doing it in a purposeful way and not just doing it all the time. Typically, people who are ruminating are just thinking in an unconstructive way about everything that could go wrong, telling themselves that they need to do that in order to prepare for it, when in reality they're not coming up with any constructive idea about how they would handle a situation. Instead, they're just walking around thinking about everything that can go wrong all the time and making themselves very anxious. The next thing we're going to talk about today is boundaries, both in terms of social media and other media, and also in terms of health protocols. When it comes to the news, there's no reason that you need to be checking the news all the time unless you actually find that comforting, which most people do not. Each person needs to decide where their personal boundary is in terms of getting news. So for example, you might decide that what you need is to check the news once a day from 2 particular news sources, and that's it. It matters less what your boundary is or where your boundary is, and more that you decide what it is and then stick to it instead of constantly wavering on what you're going to do. Another area where it's super important to set a boundary is in terms of social media. During this time of isolation, it's very understandable that people want to connect to each other, and nowadays social media is a way that we can do that. But ultimately, for most people, being on social media all the time is going to be more stressful and anxiety-provoking than comforting. And so each of us needs to determine where our boundaries are. For example, you might decide that you find comfort in reading Twitter, but that Facebook happens to bring you down. And that's fine. Whatever you decide is good for you or bad for you is okay. You just want to be mindful of where those boundaries are and stick to them. Similarly, you might realize that certain WhatsApp groups are sources of good information and make you feel safe and informed, whereas others might be groups of people who are getting anxious and piling onto each other. Remember that you're not obligated to participate in every WhatsApp conversation. You are able to set a boundary and ask people to respect that. For example, you might say to someone, hey, I'm not able to keep up with this group, but if you need to reach me, you know that you can text me. It's important to be careful about social media because it exposes us to a lot of other people's anxiety and conjecture about the future, as well as a lot of information that may or may not be true. Boundaries are also very important when it comes to safety precautions and health protocols. Needless to say, we are all following CDC and other government guidelines about keeping ourselves and other people safe. But there will always be certain areas that are gray. For example, do you Clorox your groceries when they come into the house? Do you wear a mask when you go to the store? These are decisions that should be made based on careful personal consideration and research. But once the decision is made, stick to it. Don't constantly second guess where your boundary is unless there is important new information. The next topic we're going to talk about today is one that a lot of people are talking about now, which is good, and that is self-care. Hopefully we all have a bunch of ways that we take care of ourselves in our lives in general. Unfortunately, many of those things that we do don't translate readily into our current situation. This means that we need to be proactive about finding ways to take care of ourselves during the pandemic. Obviously, this is going to look different for each person. For some people, this is going to be about exercise, getting fresh air, eating healthfully, meditating, listening to music, taking a bath. These are all valid forms of self-care. Even watching television can be a valid form of self-care if that's something that suits you or makes you feel calmer. Reaching out to other people is also a great way for you to get social support while also taking care of other people who are important to you. Again, every person is different. It's just important that we all give thought to what we're going to do to take care of ourselves and to be proactive in this domain. So to summarize what we talked about today, we covered 3 topics. We talked about fear versus rumination, and we said feeling afraid is valid and okay, but we differentiated fear from rumination. We're saying that you shouldn't constantly be in your head thinking about everything that might happen in the future. Number 2 was we talked about boundaries, and we said it's important to set boundaries both in terms of media consumption and social media consumption, and also in terms of your safety protocols. Finally, we talked about self-care. All of us need to be mindful of new ways of taking care of ourselves in this new situation, whatever that looks like for us personally. I hope the ideas in this video were helpful, but keep in mind that if you or somebody else you know is struggling, you do not need to wait until after this is over to seek professional help. Almost all therapists are seeing people online, and if you need professional help, you can access it readily from the comfort of your home. Just because you need some help right now does not mean that you'll need professional help going forward or after this is over, and it also doesn't mean that anything is wrong with you. It just might mean that you need some help figuring out how to navigate the current situation in the best way possible, and that's something that a professional can help you with. Thank you for listening. I hope this video gave you some ideas about how to take care of your mental health and minimize anxiety during this very stressful time.